That can't be right. But the footage doesn't lie.
Mr. Sinclair, what are we gonna do?
If you are innocent, then you should have no problem explaining where the contract went. The accusation cut through the grand ballroom like a sudden crack of thunder. Conversation stopped. Glasses froze halfway to lips. Dozens of wealthy investors, executives, and hotel guests turned toward the center of the room, where a young black waitress stood holding a silver serving tray. Naomi Brooks felt every eye in the ballroom settle on her at once. The luxurious hotel had been transformed into the setting for one of the most important business events of the year. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. Soft piano music drifted through the air. A multi-million-dollar partnership agreement was supposed to be signed within the hour. Instead, the room was now filled with tension. Across from Naomi stood Edward Sinclair, a 63-year-old billionaire whose reputation carried enormous influence. His tailored suit looked flawless beneath the golden lights, but his expression was anything but calm. Moments earlier, he had discovered that a sealed envelope containing the final contract had vanished from a private table reserved for executives. According to several guests, Naomi had been the last person seen near that area. Edward folded his arms. "You walked right past that table," he said. "Now the contract is missing." A murmur spread through the crowd. Naomi kept her posture straight despite the pressure building around her. She had worked at the Grand Lexington Hotel for nearly 4 years. During that time, she had served celebrities, politicians, athletes, and business leaders. Never once had anyone questioned her honesty. Yet tonight, one accusation threatened to erase years of trust in a matter of seconds. "Sir," Naomi said carefully, "I did walk past the table while serving guests, but I did not take anything." Edward's jaw tightened. That envelope was here minutes ago. The investors exchanged uneasy glances. Hotel managers began moving closer. Several security personnel appeared near the ballroom entrance. Naomi could feel the atmosphere changing. What had started as suspicion was quickly becoming judgment. She noticed the way some people looked at her. Uniform before looking away. Others whispered to one another. The pressure might have overwhelmed someone else, but Naomi refused to let panic take control. Her mother had taught her that character revealed itself most clearly during difficult moments. So she took a slow breath and remained composed. Edward pointed toward the now empty table. A contract worth millions does not simply disappear. The room fell silent again. Naomi looked at the table, then back at Edward. For a brief moment, disappointment crossed her face. Not because she was afraid, because she realized that no matter what she said, many people had already decided what they believed. Outside the ballroom windows, rain tapped softly against the glass. Inside, the tension felt heavy enough to stop time. Then Naomi spoke words that surprised everyone. "Then let us look at the hotel cameras." A few guests blinked in surprise. Security personnel exchanged looks. Edward gave a short, skeptical laugh. "You think the cameras will help you?" Naomi met his gaze without raising her voice. "If the truth matters, then yes." The confidence in her answer caused the room to grow even quieter. For the first time that evening, several people began questioning whether they had rushed to judgment. But Edward remained certain. He believed the footage would confirm exactly what he already suspected. Neither of them knew that within the next hour, the cameras would reveal far more than a missing contract. As security personnel began coordinating access to the surveillance system, the ballroom remained suspended in uneasy silence. Nobody returned to their conversations. Nobody focused on the event that had brought them there. The missing contract had become the only subject anyone cared about. Naomi Brooks stood quietly near one of the marble columns while hotel managers spoke in hushed tones nearby. Although dozens of eyes continued drifting toward her, she refused to shrink beneath their attention. She had learned long ago that panic often made innocent people appear guilty. Instead, she concentrated on breathing slowly and remaining composed. Few people in that room knew anything about her life beyond the uniform she wore. They saw a waitress carrying trays through luxury events. They did not see the woman who woke before sunrise every morning. They did not see the daughter who spent evenings helping her father recover after years of serious health problems. They did not see the countless sacrifices hidden behind her calm smile. Naomi had grown up on the south side of Chicago in a family where honesty mattered more than money. Her father often reminded her that a person's reputation was built through thousands of small decisions. That lesson stayed with her throughout adulthood. While many of her friends chased careers in larger cities, Naomi remained close to home whenever her family needed support. When medical expenses increased several years earlier, she accepted additional shifts at the Grand Lexington Hotel without complaint. Over time, managers came to trust her completely. Guests frequently requested her section because of her professionalism and kindness. Some visitors even remembered her name months after meeting her. Yet tonight, all of that history seemed invisible. One accusation from a billionaire had suddenly outweighed years of integrity. Across the ballroom, Edward Sinclair stood surrounded by investors and legal advisors. Unlike Naomi, he was accustomed to being believed immediately. For more than 4 decades, he had built one of the country's most successful real estate companies. Newspapers regularly described him as decisive. Business magazines praised his instincts. People listened when he spoke. Success had taught him many valuable lessons, but it had also created a dangerous habit. He rarely questioned his own conclusions. As several executives discussed contingency plans for the delayed signing ceremony, Edward remained convinced that the missing contract would eventually be traced back to Naomi. To him, the explanation seemed obvious. She had been near the table. The envelope was gone. The pieces appeared to fit together. Yet something about her reaction continued bothering him. Most people facing such pressure would have become defensive. Naomi had done the opposite. She had calmly requested the cameras. The confidence in her voice lingered in his thoughts. Nearby, guests exchanged quiet observations. Some believed Naomi was innocent. Others were less certain. A few simply wanted answers. The atmosphere felt heavy beneath the ballroom's elegant lights. Rain continued tapping softly against the tall windows overlooking the city. Then a hotel security supervisor approached the group. "The surveillance team is preparing the footage now," he announced. "It may take several minutes to pull recordings from all relevant cameras." Heads immediately turned toward him. The waiting had begun. Naomi looked toward the hallway leading to the security office. She felt nervous, but not because she feared what the cameras would show. She feared something else entirely. She understood that even when evidence proved the truth, some people never fully abandoned their first assumptions. Still, she lifted her chin and walked forward. The cameras were about to tell a story that nobody in that ballroom expected to hear. The walk from the ballroom to the security office felt longer than it actually was. A small group followed behind the hotel security supervisor through a quiet corridor lined with framed photographs and polished brass fixtures. Edward Sinclair walked near the front alongside several executives and attorneys. Naomi Brooks followed a short distance behind, her footsteps steady despite the attention surrounding her. Nobody seemed interested in returning to the event. The missing contract had become more important than the celebration itself. By the time they reached the surveillance room, nearly 20 people had gathered outside the door. The atmosphere felt strangely tense. Inside, multiple screens covered an entire wall. Security technicians moved between computers while downloading footage from different cameras throughout the hotel. The soft hum of equipment filled the room. One technician glanced toward the supervisor. "We have recordings from the ballroom entrance, the executive lounge, and the contract signing area," he said. "We are organizing the timeline now." Everyone waited. Edward crossed his arms. His confidence remained visible, but impatience had begun replacing certainty. Every passing minute delayed a business agreement worth millions of dollars. Investors who had traveled across the country were now standing inside a security office instead of attending the event they expected. Edward disliked uncertainty. He built his career on controlling situations before they became problems. Yet tonight, control seemed farther away than usual. Naomi stood quietly near the back of the room. She watched the screens without speaking. The pressure around her had not disappeared. If anything, it had increased. The cameras represented her opportunity to clear her name, but they also represented something deeper. They would expose how quickly people had been willing to assume the worst. As she looked around the room, she noticed expressions beginning to change. Some guests who had seemed certain of her guilt now appeared uncomfortable. Others avoided eye contact entirely. The waiting itself was becoming a lesson. One of the younger investors finally broke the silence. "How long until we see something?" A technician answered without looking away from his monitor. A few more minutes. Outside, rain continued falling across the city. Inside, the room felt suspended between two versions of reality. In one version, Edward's accusation would be confirmed. In the other, everything people believed about the evening would collapse. Edward stared at the blank playback screen. He replayed the sequence in his mind. The contract had been placed on a reserved table beside a portfolio. He remembered reviewing it shortly before greeting guests. Then came conversations, introductions, speeches, and networking. At some point, the envelope disappeared. Naomi had walked past the table. Several witnesses had noticed. To Edward, the conclusion still seemed logical. Yet logic alone did not explain her calmness. Most innocent people became frightened when accused. Naomi had become focused. The difference bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Finally, one of the technicians leaned back in his chair. "We have the timeline." The room instantly grew silent. Conversation stopped. Even the sound of movement seemed to disappear. The supervisor nodded toward the screen. The first camera angle appeared. Grainy footage showed the ballroom from above. Guests entered. Staff moved between tables. Musicians prepared equipment. The evening rewound to the beginning. Every eye fixed on the screen. Naomi folded her hands quietly in front of her. Edward stepped closer. Nobody spoke. Nobody looked away. Somewhere within the next few minutes, the cameras would reveal exactly what happened to the missing contract. And although nobody realized it yet, the footage was about to expose far more than the location of an envelope. The recording began several hours before the accusation. Guests entered the ballroom in a steady stream. Hotel employees moved efficiently between tables. Musicians prepared equipment near the stage. The footage played silently while everyone watched. At first, nothing appeared unusual. Naomi Brooks could be seen carrying trays, greeting guests, and performing the same responsibilities she completed during every event. The camera shifted between angles. One screen showed the ballroom entrance. Another focused on the executive section where the contract had been placed. A third displayed activity around the reception area. Security technicians advanced the timeline minute by minute. The room remained completely silent except for the occasional click of a keyboard. Edward Sinclair watched closely. Every time Naomi appeared on screen, his attention sharpened. Several investors leaned forward in their seats. Hotel managers stood near the wall. Nobody wanted to miss the moment when the truth finally emerged. Then the footage reached the period shortly before the contract disappeared. The executive table came into view. A sealed envelope rested beside a black leather portfolio exactly where Edward remembered leaving it. Guests moved through the background. Conversations took place. Waiters passed carrying drinks and appetizers. Naomi appeared briefly, walking through the area while serving attendees. The technician paused the video. "This is approximately 15 minutes before the envelope was reported missing," he explained. Edward nodded. "Keep going." The recording resumed. Naomi crossed the screen and continued toward another group of guests. She never stopped near the table. She never touched the envelope. She simply walked past while working. A few people exchanged uncertain looks. The footage continued. Several other guests approached the executive section during the next few minutes. One investor picked up a brochure. Another adjusted a chair. A hotel coordinator delivered event materials. Nothing seemed significant. Yet the longer the video played, the more uncomfortable the atmosphere became. The certainty that had filled the room earlier was beginning to fade. Naomi stood quietly near the back, watching the same footage as everyone else. She felt no satisfaction, no sense of victory, only patience. She knew the truth did not need help from her. The cameras would speak for themselves. Another angle appeared on the main screen. This camera provided a clearer view of the executive table. The technician slowed the playback speed. Every movement became easier to follow. Edward could now see himself entering the frame. He approached the table carrying several documents while speaking with an investor. The room immediately grew more attentive. Everyone understood that the critical moment might be approaching. Edward watched himself on screen. He remembered that conversation. He remembered reviewing paperwork before greeting additional guests. Yet there were details he had not noticed at the time. Small details, the kind people often missed when distracted. The footage continued. Edward placed one folder on the table, then another. The sealed contract remained visible beside them. He glanced down while speaking to someone off camera. Then he gathered several documents and moved toward another area of the ballroom. The technician paused the video again. "Should I continue?" he asked. Nobody answered immediately. Several people were staring at the frozen image. Something had changed. A question had appeared where certainty once existed. Edward narrowed his eyes and stepped closer to the screen. For the first time that evening, doubt entered his expression. Whatever happened next was about to challenge everything he believed had occurred inside that ballroom. The frozen image remained on the screen while the entire room stared in silence. Edward Sinclair stepped closer until he was only a few feet away from the monitor. His eyes narrowed as he studied the details. The camera angle showed him standing beside the executive table exactly as he remembered. The sealed contract rested near a black leather portfolio. Several folders were spread across the surface. Nothing appeared unusual at first glance. Yet something about the image felt different now. A security technician zoomed in slightly. The room became even quieter. Edward watched carefully. The playback resumed at half speed. Every movement unfolded with uncomfortable clarity. On the screen, Edward continued speaking with an investor while organizing documents. He picked up one folder, then another. A few seconds later, he gathered multiple papers together and placed them inside the black portfolio. The contract envelope remained visible for only a moment. Then it disappeared beneath the stack. Nobody in the room spoke. The footage continued. Edward closed the portfolio and carried it away while still engaged in conversation. The executive table was left empty. The contract never remained behind. It never vanished. It traveled with him. A wave of realization moved across the room. Several guests exchanged stunned looks. One attorney slowly lowered his head. A hotel manager covered her mouth with one hand. The security supervisor glanced toward Naomi before looking back at the screen. Edward remained motionless. The technician paused the recording. "Would you like me to continue?" he asked quietly. No answer came immediately. The evidence was already becoming impossible to ignore. Naomi stood exactly where she had been from the beginning. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. She simply watched. Years of working with the public had taught her that embarrassment often arrived long before an apology. The footage resumed. Another camera angle appeared. This one followed Edward as he walked through the ballroom, carrying the portfolio. He greeted guests, shook hands, and moved between conversations. The contract remained inside the case the entire time. Minutes later, the camera showed him entering a private meeting room adjacent to the ballroom. There, he placed the portfolio on a side table. The technician stopped the video again. "The timeline matches perfectly," he explained. The contract never left the portfolio after this point. The room fell silent once more. Every explanation that had supported the accusation was collapsing. Naomi had not touched the envelope. She had not approached the contract. She had not taken anything. The cameras had documented every important moment. The truth was now visible from multiple angles. Edward looked at the floor for several seconds. The confidence that had filled his voice earlier that evening was gone. In its place stood something unfamiliar. Reflection. Around him, people began remembering exactly how quickly the accusation had happened, how easily suspicion had become certainty, how rapidly assumptions had replaced facts. The realization spread through the room like a quiet wave. Naomi's reputation had nearly been damaged because of a conclusion reached before evidence existed. Outside, rain continued sliding down the hotel windows. Inside, nobody seemed concerned about the delayed business agreement anymore. The contract had been found without ever being lost. Yet the evening had become about something much larger than paperwork. Edward slowly lifted his eyes toward Naomi. For the first time since the accusation, he seemed unable to find the right words. And although the cameras had already revealed the missing contract, they had also exposed another truth that everyone in the room was now beginning to understand. For several long seconds after the footage ended, nobody moved. The surveillance room felt smaller than before, as though the weight of what everyone had witnessed had settled into the air itself. The glowing screens continued displaying frozen images from the ballroom, but nobody was paying attention to them anymore. Every thought in the room had shifted toward Naomi Brooks and the accusation that never should have happened. Edward Sinclair remained standing near the monitors. The billionaire who had spoken with such certainty less than an hour earlier now seemed unusually quiet. His reflection stared back at him from one of the dark screens. For perhaps the first time that evening, He was forced to confront something more uncomfortable than a missing contract. He was confronting his own judgment. Naomi did not rush to fill the silence. She stood calmly near the back wall, her hands folded loosely in front of her. The same composure that had carried her through the accusation remained visible now. Yet inside, she felt emotionally exhausted. Being proven innocent brought relief, but it did not erase the experience. She could still remember the expressions in the ballroom, the whispers, the assumptions, the certainty with which people had accepted a story before evidence existed. A hotel manager finally cleared his throat. "Miss Brooks," he said quietly, "I want you to know that we appreciate your professionalism throughout all of this." Naomi nodded politely. "Thank you." Another executive looked toward the floor before speaking. "I think many of us reached conclusions too quickly." No one disagreed. Around the room, faces carried varying degrees of discomfort. Some people avoided eye contact. Others seemed lost in thought. The footage had done more than solve a mystery. It had exposed how fragile fairness could become when power and assumptions entered the equation. Outside the security office, the hotel remained busy. Guests continued moving through hallways. Employees carried out their duties. Rain still tapped softly against the windows overlooking the city. Life had not stopped. Yet inside that room, time seemed suspended. Edward slowly turned toward Naomi. Their eyes met briefly. He opened his mouth as though preparing to speak, but no words came. The silence stretched between them. Not hostile, not dramatic, simply honest. Naomi could see that he understood what had happened. More importantly, she could see that he understood why it mattered. The security supervisor quietly dismissed several staff members. One by one, people began leaving the room. Conversations remained subdued. Nobody seemed eager to discuss business agreements or investment opportunities anymore. The evening had become something else entirely. Naomi glanced toward the doorway. Part of her wanted to return to work and leave the situation behind. Another part of her knew that some moments changed people whether they wanted them to or not. Edward watched the remaining guests file out. His expression had softened. The confidence that usually defined him had been replaced by reflection. For decades, he had built a reputation on making quick decisions. Tonight, those instincts had failed him, and the realization was impossible to ignore. Eventually, the room grew nearly empty. Only a handful of people remained. The storm outside had begun to fade. Raindrops slid slowly down the glass while distant city lights reflected against the wet streets below. Naomi looked toward the hallway leading back to the ballroom. The contract had been found. The truth had been revealed. Yet somehow the most important part of the evening still felt unfinished. Because while the cameras had answered one question, they had quietly raised another. What happens after the truth is finally seen by everyone in the room? The walk back toward the ballroom felt very different from the walk that had brought everyone to the security office. Earlier, the hallway had been filled with certainty. Now it was filled with reflection. The group moved slowly beneath the warm lights of the hotel corridor. Nobody seemed eager to speak. The footage had removed every doubt about what happened to the contract, but it had also forced people to examine their own reactions. Naomi Brooks walked near the back of the group. She could feel eyes turning toward her again, yet this time the expressions were different. The suspicion was gone. In its place lingered something closer to respect, mixed with discomfort. As they entered the ballroom, conversations immediately faded. Word had spread quickly throughout the hotel. Guests who had remained behind knew that the cameras had revealed the truth. They simply did not know the details. The elegant room that had once felt tense now carried a different energy. Curiosity moved through the crowd. Investors glanced toward Edward Sinclair. Hotel staff looked toward Naomi. Nobody seemed certain what would happen next. Near the center of the ballroom stood the executive table where the entire misunderstanding had begun. The same table, the same lights, the same guests. Yet everything felt different now. Edward paused before continuing forward. For several moments, he simply looked around the room. The billionaire who usually appeared completely comfortable in public suddenly seemed thoughtful. The attention that once strengthened his confidence now appeared heavier than before. He understood something important. The accusation had happened publicly. The truth had been revealed publicly. What came next could not happen in private. Naomi quietly resumed holding the serving tray she had set aside earlier. She intended to return to work. As far as she was concerned, the matter was finished. The cameras had shown the truth. Nothing more needed to be said. Yet before she could move away, Edward's voice stopped her. "Miss Brooks." The room grew silent once again. Naomi turned slowly. Every guest nearby was watching. Edward stepped forward. His expression contained none of the certainty that had defined him earlier. Instead, there was humility. Real humility. He glanced briefly toward the crowd before returning his attention to Naomi. "I owe you an apology." The words hung in the air. No one moved. No one interrupted. Edward continued. "Tonight, I made an accusation before I had all the facts. I allowed an assumption to become a conclusion." His voice remained steady, but the sincerity behind it was impossible to miss. The cameras showed what should have been obvious from the beginning. You did nothing wrong. A quiet stillness settled over the ballroom. Some guests lowered their eyes. Others exchanged thoughtful looks. Naomi listened carefully. She could see that the apology was genuine, not because of the words themselves, but because of the effort it clearly required. For a man accustomed to being right, admitting a mistake in front of an audience was not easy. Edward took a slow breath. "Your professionalism tonight showed more character than I demonstrated." Several investors nodded almost instinctively. The statement reflected exactly what many of them were thinking. Naomi remained calm. She could have embarrassed him. She could have reminded everyone what had happened. Instead, she simply offered a small nod. "Thank you," she said quietly. Nothing more. No speech. No victory. Just grace. The simplicity of her response seemed to affect the room even more than the apology itself. And as the evening finally began moving forward again, many people realized they had witnessed something far more valuable than a business agreement. They had witnessed the moment when truth changed not only a situation, but a person. The rest of the evening unfolded differently than anyone had expected when they first entered the ballroom. The contract was eventually retrieved from the portfolio exactly where the cameras showed it had been placed. Attorneys reviewed the documents one final time. Investors returned to their conversations. Musicians resumed playing soft melodies beneath the glow of the chandeliers. On the surface, the event seemed to recover. Yet something important had changed. The people who remained in the room carried a new awareness with them. Naomi Brooks returned to her responsibilities without drawing attention to herself. She delivered refreshments, cleared tables, and assisted guests exactly as she had before the accusation. If anyone expected her to behave differently after being proven right, they were disappointed. She did not seek recognition. She did not remind anyone what had happened. She simply continued doing her job with the same professionalism she had shown from the beginning. That quiet consistency became impossible to ignore. Throughout the evening, several guests approached her privately. Some offered kind words. Others apologized for assumptions they never voiced aloud but knew they had made. Naomi accepted each conversation with grace. She understood that people were imperfect. She also understood that growth often began with uncomfortable reflection. Across the ballroom, Edward Sinclair sat at a table reviewing final paperwork before the delayed signing ceremony. Yet his attention repeatedly drifted elsewhere. More than once, he found himself watching Naomi move through the room. Not because of guilt alone, because he was trying to understand something. For years, he had evaluated people through quick impressions. In business, those instincts had often served him well. Tonight, they had failed completely. The realization remained difficult to ignore. Eventually, the formal signing ceremony began. Investors gathered near the stage. Cameras from several business publications recorded the event. Executives shook hands. Documents were signed. Applause filled the room. It should have been the defining moment of the evening. Yet for many people present, it was not. The memory that would stay with them involved a waitress who remained calm while her integrity was questioned. Later that night, after most guests had departed, the ballroom grew quieter. Hotel employees began cleaning tables and organizing equipment. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. Reflections from city lights shimmered across the wet streets below. Naomi carried a stack of folded linens toward a service station near the back of the room. As she worked, she noticed someone approaching. It was one of the younger investors who had attended the event. He hesitated before speaking. "I just wanted to say something," he said. "Watching how you handled tonight taught me more than any business presentation I heard here." Naomi smiled politely. "Thank you." The investor nodded. Most people would have become angry. Naomi considered the comment for a moment. "Sometimes the truth does not need help," she replied. "Sometimes it only needs time." The investor smiled thoughtfully before walking away. Nearby, Edward happened to overhear the exchange. The simple statement remained with him, long after the ballroom emptied, long after the documents were signed, long after the evening officially ended. Because beneath all the business discussions, contracts, and financial negotiations, the most valuable lesson of the night had never been written on paper. It had been demonstrated by a woman who refused to let other people's assumptions define her character. And for Edward, that lesson was only beginning to change the way he saw the world. The following morning arrived with clear skies and bright sunlight reflecting across the glass towers surrounding the Grand Lexington Hotel. The storm that had covered the city the night before was gone. Guests checked out. Business travelers hurried through the lobby. Hotel employees moved through another ordinary day. To most people entering the building, nothing appeared unusual. Yet for those who had witnessed the events of the previous evening, something had changed. Naomi Brooks arrived for her shift just before sunrise. As always, she entered through the employee entrance carrying the same bag she brought every day. She greeted co-workers with a smile and tied on her uniform before reporting to the restaurant level. There were no special announcements waiting for her. No celebration. No ceremony. Just work. Exactly the way she preferred it. The breakfast crowd arrived steadily throughout the morning. Families occupied corner tables. Executives reviewed reports over coffee. Visitors discussed travel plans. Naomi moved between them with the same calm professionalism that had defined her for years. If anyone expected her to behave differently after everything that happened, they quickly discovered otherwise. She remained the same person she had been before the accusation. Kind, patient, focused. Around mid-morning, a familiar figure entered the restaurant. Several guests recognized him immediately. Edward Sinclair paused near the entrance and looked around the room. Unlike the previous evening, there was no crowd surrounding him. No investors. No attorneys. No reporters. Just a man walking quietly into a hotel restaurant. Naomi noticed him almost immediately. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the room. Then she continued working. Edward slowly approached the section where she was serving guests. Conversations continued around them. Sunlight streamed through tall windows overlooking the city. The atmosphere felt peaceful. When he reached her station, he stopped. Naomi turned toward him. Neither spoke for a moment. The silence felt comfortable rather than tense. Edward glanced around the restaurant before speaking. I spent a long time thinking about last night. Naomi listened quietly. I realized something, he continued. The cameras showed where the contract went. But they also showed something about me that I should have seen much sooner. Naomi remained silent, allowing him to finish. Edward smiled slightly. I judged someone before I knew them. The words were simple, honest, uncomplicated. Naomi nodded. We all have moments we wish we could do differently. Edward looked out the window where sunlight reflected across the streets below. The important part is learning from them. Naomi offered a small smile. Yes, it is. A server called her name from across the room. Another table needed assistance. Naomi glanced toward the guest area. Then she looked back at Edward. Have a good day, Mr. Sinclair. He nodded. You too, Miss Brooks. She turned and walked away to continue her work. Edward watched her for a moment before heading toward the exit. Neither looked back. Outside, the city continued moving beneath the morning light. Inside, the restaurant returned to its normal rhythm. Cups clinked softly. Conversations drifted through the air. Sunlight warmed the floor beside the windows. There was no dramatic ending. No grand reward. No final speech. Only a quiet truth resting in the space between two people. One had been forced to confront an assumption. The other had chosen dignity instead of bitterness. And as Naomi continued serving guests beneath the golden morning light, the lesson remained behind like a gentle echo. Character speaks loudly. Truth speaks eventually. But kindness, even when tested, speaks longest of all.
You.
Thank you. You're welcome. Have a nice day.